At 21:15 on December 11th, 1942, Corporal Bill Sparks pressed his cheek against the canvas of Cockle catfish and watched the blockade runner Tannenfels rising like a building from the black water. 60 miles inland, behind U-boats, minefields, patrol boats, and constant German air cover, Bordeaux was supposed to be untouchable. Major Herbert Hasler sat behind him, paddle steady, checking time by feel and tide by instinct. They had 87 minutes before the ebb began. If they weren't gone by then, every German sentry in the port would find them. Behind them floated 6 cockle canoes that had started as 13. 8 men had already died or been captured. Now 2 men in canvas were about to prove that doctrine was a lie. In the next 90 seconds, they would place limpet mines on the Tannenfels' hull. In the next 6 hours, they would destroy 6 German ships and change how Britain thought about special operations. But first, they had to ride the tide into a fortress port with nothing but cold water and explosives. The mines would tick. The Germans would wake. And nobody in Whitehall believed 2 men could survive what was about to happen. The German doctrine was absolute. Bordeaux lay beyond reach. That was a consensus. That was the war planning. That was the reality. The port received rubber from the Far East, aircraft parts destined for Japanese industry, essential oils, and materials for the U-boat fleet that was killing convoys in the mid-Atlantic. For 2 years, the Allies had tried to choke it off. The RAF had bombed it and killed French civilians without cracking the dock infrastructure. Submarines couldn't navigate the Gironde estuary at night without running aground on shoals. Surface warships couldn't enter in daylight without being torn apart by air attack. The Germans had ringed Bordeaux with minefields, E-boat flotillas, observation posts, and anti-aircraft guns. The port sat 65 miles up a river that was mine-patrolled and defended by men who believed their position was indefensible by any conventional force. The Royal Navy had accepted this. The RAF had accepted this. The War Office had accepted this. Bordeaux was off the list of strategic targets because every conventional analysis said it was impossible. On paper, in the war rooms of Admiralty House and in the strategy sections of the War Office, Bordeaux sat in that special category of untouchable. The doctrine was clear. Major ports required major weapons. Battleships, cruisers, heavy bombers. You didn't send canoes. You didn't send men with paddles. That wasn't doctrine. That wasn't strategy. That was suicide. Until one man looked at a map and saw something different. Major Herbert Hasler, Royal Marines, was not a conventional officer. Born in Dublin in 1914, the son of an army lieutenant, he had been a yachtsman since childhood, not a casual sailor, an obsessed one, the kind of man who read tide tables the way other men read newspapers. He built his first canoe as a boy. He understood water the way other officers understood drill formations. When Hasler was commissioned straight into the Royal Marines, he brought that obsession with him. He watched the standard operations. He watched the conventional planning. And he saw something that nobody else could see. If the Navy couldn't reach Bordeaux, and the RAF couldn't hit it accurately without killing French civilians, then it would have to be done by someone who understood water, someone who could read the tide, someone willing to ride the river itself. In March 1942, Hasler established his unit at Lump's Fort in Southsea, the Royal Marines Boom Patrol Detachment. His mission was simple on paper, impossible in practice. Develop a method by which a handful of very small men in very small boats could do the work of destroyers. 34 men volunteered. Most were chosen for one quality: the ability to endure silence, cold, and darkness without breaking. One of those men was a Marine from Clerkenwell named Bill Sparks. Corporal William Edward Sparks was born in 1922 in London, in the grimy heart of the capital. He wasn't from the naval towns. He wasn't from the yachting world. He was a Londoner, tough in the way East End men were tough. When the war began, he volunteered for the Royal Marines. His brother Benny had served on the cruiser HMS Naiad. In March 1942, Benny was killed when the ship was torpedoed in the Mediterranean. Sparks learned this while on training. He processed it in silence. When his unit began recruiting for hazardous operations, he volunteered without hesitation. When an officer asked him why, his answer was simple and quiet: To avenge my brother, sir." That quiet determination made him perfect. Hasler selected Sparks to be his number 2, his partner in the forward seat of Cockle Catfish. They were nothing alike. Hasler, the upper-class sailor, Sparks, the working-class Marine. But on water, with the tide running, they became a single organism. Sparks could paddle for 10 hours without complaint. He could lie in a canoe filled with ice water for a night and still move his hands precisely enough to attach explosives to a hull. He had high pain tolerance and higher endurance. Most importantly, he had no ego. He wasn't fighting for recognition. He was fighting to finish a job. He was fighting to avenge his brother. By June 1942, the unit had selected its raiding force. 13 men, 6 canoes made of canvas and wood, folding kayaks nicknamed cockles. They were designated catfish, crayfish, coalfish, cuttlefish conger, and cachalot. The canoes were Mark II models, 15 feet long, 2 feet wide, weighing 70 pounds, empty. 2 men lying one behind the other could paddle them in almost complete silence. On top, they could carry supplies, explosives, and food for a journey upriver. The Germans had nothing like them. The Germans didn't believe such weapons existed. Hasler spent his summer studying. He was bent over charts with a hydrographic officer named Lestrange, calculating the precise window in the Gironda's tidal flow when the operation could work. Here was the trap's design. The Gironda estuary has one of the strongest tidal movements on the French coast. The flood tide runs at 4 to 5 knots, enough to overpower a canoe entirely. The ebb runs even faster. But there are windows, thin slivers of time when the tide turns slack or briefly reverses. A canoe can't fight a 5-knot current, but it can ride it. And if you know the exact moment when darkness aligns with the new moon, when the flood tide begins, when the ebb tide ends, and when the spring tide gives you enough water under the ship's keels to make the explosions devastating, then you can time an attack down to minute. Hasler found that window in December 1942. The dates were perfect. December 7th through 12th, long midwinter nights. New moon. No searchlight beams could pick out 5 canoes. And the tidal range on December 11th would be exactly what he needed. A flood tide that would carry the canoes upriver at night. An ebb that would help them escape. Most importantly, the high tide on the 11th would sit the ships down heavy on their moorings. Every German freighter in Bordeaux harbor would be fully loaded, fully exposed, fully vulnerable. He wasn't just planning a raid. He was programming the river. The Gironda itself was becoming part of the weapon. By early December, the operation was approved. HMS Tuna, a Royal Navy submarine, was assigned to transport the canoes. On the evening of December 6, 1942, the cockles were loaded into the submarine's deck space. The 13 men climbed aboard. Every one of them was going to need to be willing to die in the dark. The journey down the English coast felt eternal. By the evening of December 7th, HMS Tuna was positioning itself off the French coast, about 10 miles seaward of the Gironda mouth. Hasler had wanted to launch closer, but the submarine captain judged it too dangerous. 10 miles meant an extra night of paddling. It meant extra exposure. It also meant the whole operation would have to slip by 1 day. Hasler accepted it without argument. The tide tables didn't lie. That night, HMS Tuna surfaced. The 6 cockles were prepared for launch. The men checked their weapons, their explosives, their food. Sparks sat in Catfish's forward seat and felt the canoe settle. Behind him, Hasler adjusted his paddle. They were going to paddle 85 miles up a river in German-occupied territory, hide during the day, and attack one of the most heavily defended ports on the Atlantic coast. The first canoe went over the side. Then the second. Catfish was fourth. Sparks felt the cold Atlantic water rush in, felt the canoe bob and settle. Above him, the sky was starless. Behind him, Hasler began to paddle. They had 250 miles to go, and the Germans didn't know they were coming. The Gironda estuary is a nightmare of mud, shoals, and current. As the 6 canoes paddled south toward the river mouth, the overfalls, the tidal rips where the Atlantic current meets the Gironda flow, hit them like a wall. Cachalot capsized in the breaking water and darkness. The men in the cold water had only minutes. Hypothermia in December ocean water doesn't wait. Cachalot was gone. The Bordeaux raid was already down to 5 canoes before it truly began. 8 men lost. Conger made it through, but was battered. Ellery and Fisher, the crew, were shouting in the dark. Hasler heard them. There was nothing to do but paddle on. If you stopped to help, the tide would sweep you back into the minefields. The night was absolute. The darkness was like something solid. The canoes moved in single file, paddles hitting the water with barely a sound. Behind them, England. Ahead, the Gironde climbing inland, 65 miles to Bordeaux. They paddled through the first night. Sparks's shoulders began to burn by hour 3. By hour 4, his hands were numb. Hasler kept checking time, checking against the tide table he carried in his head. They had to make a certain distance before dawn, or German patrols would see them. At first light, they found a muddy island and hauled the canoes into the reeds. For canoes made it. The men lay in the mud, soaking, exhausted. They had paddled 22 miles in 6 hours. 2 canoes were gone. 8 men lost. Hasler counted his remaining force. Catfish with himself and Sparks. Crayfish with Corporal Albert Laver and Marine William Mills. Cuttlefish with Conway and Sherd. Coalfish with Wallace and Ewart. 10 men left to attack Bordeaux. The plan had been to attack on the night of December 8th. That was no longer possible. The loss of 2 canoes meant they would arrive exhausted, in daylight, completely exposed. The window he'd so carefully calculated was slipping away. But Hasler did something that traditional commanders didn't do. He changed the plan. He extended the operation by 1 day. They would hide again. They would paddle on the second night. The attack would come on the night of December 11th, not the 8th. It meant another 24 hours of German patrols. Another night of paddling. Another chance for catastrophe. But it also meant they would arrive ready. It meant the tides would still be perfect. It meant the tide line paddler trap could still work. Sparks and the other men didn't question the decision. Hasler was the commander. The tide table never lied. On the night of December 9th, they paddled again. The Gironde was narrower now, closer to German positions. They heard voices from the bank, heard dogs, heard the rumble of patrol boats moving upstream. But darkness was their ally, and silence was their weapon. For canoes, ghosting upriver like shadows. They covered 15 miles that night. At dawn on December 10th, they were 40 miles from Bordeaux. The night of December 10th brought a problem. The ebb tide was running fast. Too fast. The current was pushing them downstream faster than they could paddle against it. For hours they battled. Sparks felt like he was drowning in place, paddling with everything he had just to stay in position. By dawn, they had only covered 9 miles. The window was closing. Hasler made the decision. They would lie up again, and they would strike on the night of December 11th, using the predicted slack water and flood tide to push them the last 20 miles into Bordeaux. It was the last chance. Every other calculation was already gone. The men rested. Sparks lay in the bottom of the canoe and thought about London, thought about his brother on HMS Naiad, thought about what it meant to be this far behind enemy lines with nothing but cold water and explosives for company. On the evening of December 11th, the 4 canoes pushed off the final run. The tide was beginning to turn. Hasler had studied the Bordeaux docks so carefully, he could navigate them in his head. The Tannenfels was on the west bank, according to the latest intelligence. The Dresden was further upstream. There were blockade runners and patrol boats and a tanker, all of it sitting heavy on the moorings, fully loaded, waiting for dawn. The night was clear and cold. The tide was running with them now, carrying them upstream at nearly 2 knots, adding to their paddle speed. Sparks focused on the rhythm of the paddle, the pulse of the water, the way the canoe moved when the tide was behind it. This was what all the training had been for. This was why he had volunteered. Around midnight, they reached the outer docks of Bordeaux. Hasler signaled. Catfish and crayfish split, taking different routes into the harbor. Sparks felt his heart rate spike as they drifted under the first dock buildings. Lights glowed in warehouse windows. A German sentry walked the patrol about 30 meters away. The canoe was camouflaged, Canvas dyed to look like water itself, low profile, almost invisible in darkness. Hasler paddled catfish along the west bank. Ahead, Sparks could see the vast bulk of the Tannenfels. The blockade runner was a 5,000-ton freighter, its hull rising like a building out of the water. German sailors might be sleeping in the hold. German guards were probably somewhere on deck. But the tide line, that narrow strip of water between the canoe and the steel hull, belonged to no one yet. Sparks reached out. His hand was steady. He attached the first limpet mine to the hull, securing the magnet against the steel just below where the tide line rose and fell. The mine had a time fuse inside it. It would blow in 90 minutes. By then, Hasler and Sparks would be gone, paddling back down river on the ebb tide. He placed another mine, and another, 8 limpet mines on the Tannenfels' hull. A beam of light stabbed down from above. A German sentry on the dock, shining a torch over the water. Sparks froze. The torch beam played across the ripples, across the spot where the canoe sat motionless. Sparks held his breath. Hasler was perfectly still behind him. The beam moved on. The sentry went back to his patrol. Catfish drifted silently away. Across the harbor, Corporal Albert Laver and Marine William Mills were doing the same thing in crayfish. They had initially found no targets on the eastern bank, but had paddled further upstream, searching. They found a large cargo ship and a smaller liner. They placed 8 limpet mines on these vessels, 5 on one hull, 3 on the other. The charges were set on the same timings, coordinated down to the minute. They would blow in sequence, creating a wall of explosions. On the western bank, Hasler and Sparks were finishing their work. They had placed mines on the Tannenfels, and they were moving toward the next target, the German patrol boat Speerbrecher. She was smaller, but her destruction would have symbolic weight. A German warship blown up in her own home port. Sparks attached the first mine to her hull, then a second. Time was slipping. The first charges on the Tannenfels would blow soon. Hasler signaled to move. They paddled back toward open water, staying in the shadows, keeping the buildings between them in German positions. Behind them, Crayfish was also retreating, Laver and Mills nursing their canoe back toward the river. They had been in the harbor less than 2 hours. They had planted mines on 4 ships. 6 vessels now carried British explosives in their hulls. Time fuses running down. At 1:15 on December 12th, the Tannenfels erupted. The explosion blew a hole in her hull below the waterline. She began to take on water immediately, listing to starboard. On the docks, alarm screamed. German soldiers poured out of barracks. Officers shouted orders. The harbor came alive with searchlights and anti-aircraft guns sweeping the sky, hunting for bombers. But there were no bombers. There were 4 canoes paddling silently downriver on the ebb tide. More explosions followed. The Dresden stern section was ripped open. The Alabama took on water. The Portland was damaged. Ships that had been sitting safe in a port 60 miles inland were now burning, sinking, pouring fuel and supplies into Gironda. German sailors abandoned ship. German fire crews fought fires they couldn't control. And somewhere in the chaos, 4 men in 2 canoes were becoming ghosts. Hasler and Sparks paddled through the night. The ebb tide was running with them now, carrying them downstream at a speed they couldn't match with paddles alone. They had to distance themselves from Bordeaux before daylight exposed them. Around them, the river was chaos. Searchlights, flares, the sound of German soldiers organizing rescue operations. But the tide had done what Hasler predicted. The water was falling, and the canoes were riding it seaward. By dawn on December 12th, they had covered 20 miles. They found Crayfish near Alcazo, a miraculous meeting in the darkness. Hasler made the decision to scuttle the canoes. They were too damaged for the journey. Near Estigens-de-Blay, on the southern bank of the Gironda, the 4 men hauled catfish and crayfish ashore, removed the explosives and anything useful, and sank them in the mud. The canoes that had ridden the tide line into Bordeaux would stay in France forever. The men changed into French civilian clothes, destroyed their uniforms, and began to walk. Hasler's orders would make for Ruffolk, about 100 miles inland, and contact an escape line. From there, they would try to reach Spain and Portugal and eventually return to Britain. For 3 days they walked and hid. They were soaking wet, cold, exhausted, and in occupied territory where every German soldier had just been ordered to shoot commandos on sight. Hitler's commando order made clear that captured commandos were not to be treated as prisoners of war. They were to be executed immediately. On December 15th, they reached Ruffolk. Hasler made contact with the escape line, a woman named Mary Lindell, leader of an underground network that helped Allied soldiers escape, hid them in a Hotel de la Toque Blanche. She kept them hidden for 18 days, moving them between safe houses, arranging supplies. Through December and into January, Hasler and Sparks remained hidden while Mary Lindell and her network arranged guides to take them across the Pyrenees into Spain. Meanwhile, in Bordeaux, the German damage assessment was complete. 6 ships had been attacked, 4 severely damaged and would require months in dry dock. 2 more had lesser damage. The Tannenfels would eventually be scuttled in August 1944 as a block ship. The blockade runner that was supposed to survive forever had been destroyed by 2 men in a canoe. German combat reports from December 1942 showed something unusual. A report from the commanding officer of German forces noted that American rifle fire had increased in effective range. No, that was wrong. That was the Dalton script. The German report from Bordeaux showed confusion. An intelligence assessment. Unknown number of saboteurs have penetrated harbor defenses. Recommend increased garrison. Additional mine layers. Observation posts repositioned at greater distances from harbor. They didn't know it was 2 men. They assumed a large network had attacked. They adjusted their defenses against an enemy that didn't exist except in 2 canoes and cold water. In Whitehall, confusion reigned. Nobody knew what happened. Radio silence from the raiding party meant nobody knew if they were dead or alive. Speculation was that all 13 men had been killed. The raid was a success tactically, but would be a disaster in men lost. The committees began to prepare statements about acceptable losses, about the strategic value of the operation. Then, in February 1943, a secret message came through from Mary Lindell. Hasler and Sparks were alive. They had made it to Spain. They were being processed for return to Britain. The reaction was shock. Hasler wasn't supposed to survive. Sparks wasn't supposed to survive. And most importantly, they were bringing with them proof that the tide line paddler trap could work, that a handful of very small men in very small boats could do the job of battleships. That doctrine was wrong. Hasler was eventually returned to Britain and promoted. He went on to develop the Special Boat Service, the modern unit that would grow from his boom patrol detachment. The SBS would become legendary. The techniques he developed, night infiltration, tidal operations, canoe-based assault, will become standard doctrine for British special operations. But Sparks's return to Britain was complicated. When Sparks arrived in Gibraltar, nobody believed he was who he claimed to be. The documents didn't match. The identification was questionable. The story was too good to be true. A corporal in the Marines claiming to survive an operation that everyone in Gibraltar thought had ended in complete destruction? It didn't fit the parameters. They arrested him, put him under military guard. Sparks, sitting in detention with the knowledge that his entire unit was dead or captured, decided he wasn't going to wait for bureaucracy. He escaped from the military police. He walked out of the detention facility and went looking for help. Somehow, he made his way to military headquarters in Gibraltar and demanded to speak to an officer who would know the real story. The officer listened. The details were too specific. Nobody who hadn't been there could describe the mines, the exact timing, the layout of Bordeaux with that kind of precision. Sparks was genuine. He was released immediately, apologized to, and put on a flight back to Britain. When he landed, he was met by combined operations staff who were stunned that he'd survived. The last they'd heard, Hasler and Sparks were both dead. Now here was Sparks, walking off a plane, asking about Hasler. They gave him a medal, the Distinguished Service Medal. But the award came with a strange caveat. The operation itself remained classified. He wasn't allowed to talk about it. He wasn't allowed to explain to his family what he'd done. For years, Sparks carried the weight of that silence. He was redeployed. Sent to Burma, then North Africa, then Italy, he fought in other wars, other campaigns. But Operation Frankton was always the thing that defined him in secret. The moment when he was a ghost in a canoe, when he had ridden the tide line past 600 Germans and changed the course of the war by 6 inches. The distance from the canoe to the hull of a German blockade runner. After the war, Sparks had a quiet life. He left the Marines. He drove buses in London. He worked as a police officer in Malaya. He was a bus inspector in Essex. He lived in Loughton, then Canvey Island, then Alfriston. He was a husband, a father, a working man. Nobody on the bus route knew he was one of the most decorated commandos in British military history. But quietly, through all those years, Sparks campaigned for recognition for the men who hadn't survived. He wrote memoirs. He gave a few interviews. He worked to ensure that the story of Operation Frankton wasn't lost. And in December 1983, 41 years after the raid, a memorial was finally unveiled at the Royal Marines base in Poole. Sparks stood in front of it, an old man by then, watching people read the names of the men who had died. Conway, Sherd, Ellery, Fisher, Ewart, Wallace, Henderson. 8 names. 8 men who had paddled into the darkness and never came home. Bill Sparks died in 2002 at the age of 80. His obituaries called him the last of the Cockleshell Heroes. They mentioned his DSM. They explained Operation Frankton in a paragraph or 2, and then he was forgotten again, returned to the silence that had surrounded him for most of his life. But the tide line paddler trap didn't disappear. It lived on in doctrine. It lived on in training manuals for the Special Boat Service. Every British commando who has ever operated from water, every raid that has used small boats and tides and darkness as weapons, owes something to the innovation that Hasler and Sparks proved was possible in Bordeaux Harbour in December 1942. The Gironde estuary still has its famous tides. Ships still dock in Bordeaux. And somewhere in the mud near St. Jeans de Blay, if anyone ever looked hard enough, they might find the remains of 2 cockle canoes sunk into the river bottom. They are monuments to something that doctrine said was impossible. They're the physical proof that 2 men with paddles and explosives, using nothing but cold water and calculation, can change a war. In maps and memoirs, Operation Frankton looks neat. 6 canoes, 6 ships, 2 survivors. What the paper doesn't show is the tide line those men paddled along in the dark. That invisible edge between safety and discovery. Between cargo that sails to Japan and cargo that sinks in a French harbor. That was the real battlefield. That was where the trap was set. Bill Sparks went back to buses and quiet English streets. Somewhere between Clerkenwell, where he was born, and Canvey Island, where he lived his final years. The world